Guruve Gaura Chandraya Radhikaya Tadale Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tadabhaktaya Namo Namaha Vancha Kalpatruvesha Kripa Sindhuve Vacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Shri Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Dandavat Pranam devotees. So this is the maybe I think fourth and probably the last, I believe, necessary installment regarding the idea of Jiva Tattva and the genesis or origin of the Jiva's sojourn in the material world. So I think in the previous three iterations of this, we had already discussed that it's not possible for the Jiva to have fallen directly from the spiritual world. We gave ample evidence of that, and we as well quoted our Mool Praman, which is Srimad Bhagavatam, stating in fact that the Jivas don't have an origin. The Jivas are eternal, right? Mamam Vamso Jiva Loke, Jiva Bhuta Sanatana. The Jivas are eternal energy of Bhagavan. They're the Jiva Shakti, Tatastha Shakti of Bhagavan, like Jivera Srupoya Krishna Nichadas, Jivera Tatastha Shakti Vera Ve Prakash. So the Jivas are a Shakti of Bhagavan, and they are eternal. Their eternal existence is in one of two states. I shouldn't say eternal existence, but their existence is in one of two states. Either their realized state of existence in a relationship with Bhagavan, or in the state of Anadi Bada. And the word Anadi means literally Anadi, no beginning. So that beginningless state of being bound by the influence of the material energy didn't have a genesis. I've already explained from Bhagavad Gita, chapter 13, text number 20, and you can look at it directly, the commentary of Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur Pad, and he's given a question and answer directly to this fact, that the connection of the Jivas with Prakriti has no beginning, and also it has no cause. Similarly, in the Srimad Bhagavatam, which I've quoted many times throughout, Srimad Bhagavatam, 11th canto, chapter 22, text number 10, Anadi Avidya Yuktasha. So the Jiva's connection with Avidya is Anadi, beginningless. Now, it could be asked, why was it not simply presented like that throughout the historical narratives on Jiva Tattva? Why didn't Al Srila Prabhupada just say that when he came? And what we're going to deal with today is the idea about the Tatashta, and why was there a subsequent evolution to the argument regarding the fact that we had come from the Tatashta region, etc. Why all of that if simply the Jivas have from Anadi Kal been in the material Jagat throughout the cycles of the creation? Why was it not simply explained like that? Well, there could be a plethora of answers to why that was not there. In fact, if you go back in our Goswami Granthas and you look up Jiva Tattva, it was explained like that. So it wasn't like there was no basis for these explanations, but according to time, place, and circumstance, a particular narrative about the Jiva and the origin of the Jiva have been given, especially we can analyze to satisfy two things. One is an explanation of the constitutional relationship that the Atma has with Bhagavan. And secondly, an eradication of the multitude of questions that arise if we look at the idea that we have been here from time without beginning. So what kind of questions am I talking about? They were asked actually in Jiva Dharma. Why would Bhagavan put us in a position where we have to suffer? Why some Jivas went to the spiritual world and other Jivas came here? Was there some kind of bias that's inherent in the transcendental system that would cause that? So many questions like that would arise, and perhaps because of the ahamkara of the jiva and the sense of an identity separate from the seva or service to Bhagavan, the idea would arise that somehow or another there was an injustice done to some atmas and not to others. So because of the potential for the aparad towards Bhagavan, based on that mentality which really arises due to ahamkar, it's not coming from the atma, it's coming from the identification with the present condition of the atma. So in order to perhaps quell that possible aparad of blaming Bhagavan, and Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur addresses this in the 16th chapter of Jiva Dharma, the tendency the Jiva would have to blame Bhagavan. To avoid that, the various explanations were given according to the digestibility, if that's a word, of various levels of consciousness in the larger preaching circle. So the explanations, and we have a precedent. I also quoted this in a previous video, that there is a precedent for using allegory and things like that to explain a siddhanta that may not be easily understood or digestible. We had the case in the 4th canto Srimad Bhagavatam of Sri Narad Muni using allegory in the story of Puranjan to explain Atma Tattva to Maharaj Prachinavari. So our acharyas using that methodology has precedent, right? Now, we had gone over the idea of the reasoning why we look into the writings of our Srila Prabhupada, and you can find the dual statements of, yes, we were with Krishna, we fell from a relationship, etc., and the clear statements of, no one falls from Vaikuntha. So rather than the conjecture that would arise sometimes from those things, the simple methodology of relying on Guru, Sadhu, and Sastra, and not intellectualism or intellectual conjecture or speculation about it, we find the actual basis for the statement, no one falls from Vaikuntha, in unlimited Siddhantic presentations by Jiva Goswami Pad, in Chaitanya Charitamrita, in Srimad Bhagavatam, right? So we know that that is the Siddhanta. So then we also dealt with the question of why then an alternative would be presented, and I just explained that we did not necessarily come into the experience of bhakti, at least not the majority of us, being enlightened, capable persons who could just hear a siddhanta. Oh, okay, I understand. Right? Many people came and it was not so easily digestible. We did have a history, if we didn't directly have it, at least it was in our experience, of the concepts that come from Judeo-Christian teachings of an original sin and an original fall from grace. So there was some resonance in the idea of explaining things as an original falling from grace. So that would have some resonance. And for the matter of taking up the practice of bhakti, then whatever methodology would be suitable to inspire that is appropriate. So if the idea is I have the conception that I fell from grace, I was with Krishna and I fell into this world is just completely filled with suffering and so forth and so on, and now I'm inspired to practice bhakti to get out of this world of suffering and to go back to the realm of the spiritual relationship with Krishna, and inspires you to take up the practice of bhakti, excellent. There's no problem whatsoever with that. Over the course of the last so many years probably, especially after the samadhi of our Srila Prabhupada and the search for understanding more in depth the teachings of our Srila Prabhupada in relation to our Guru Parampara, because we cannot separate Srila Prabhupada from the entire Guru Parampara. And that also began to happen where, well, what we'll do is we'll take a particular institutional stance on the issue, and we'll just, anything that doesn't resonate with what we understood, that we think we understood rather, that Srila Prabhupada said, we'll just take that and we'll separate all the other teachings of our acharyas and everything else and just take this as our stance. Well, obviously that's not appropriate either. We have to remember that Srila Prabhupada is coming in parampara. He emphasized this himself. His teachings, he emphasized, are not new, but they're the intact as it is carrying on of the teachings given by Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and have come down from even the teachings of Lord Krishna and Bhagavad Gita, etc., etc. So, if we looked at it through that ideal, through the idea of Guru, Sadhu, and Sastra, then we could see that the statements regarding the fall from grace, etc., were really based on establishing the two things that I mentioned. One was implanting that the relationship we have with Krishna is organic. It is constitutional. It is not something that's being imposed. It is not foreign. At the same time, it was never meant to be an indication of a historical relationship that we had that was broken and that we somehow, by misuse of independence or whatever, abandoned and came here. That was a narrative to help us to do two things. One, take up the practice of bhakti in earnest, and two, to avoid the confusion that might have arisen by trying to digest the idea of why some jivas are in the spiritual world and some jivas are here, etc., etc. I've already kind of gone over that. So, with that understood, we can talk about the next evolution. As devotees had gained some maturity in understanding the philosophy, and they also had some inspiration to try to deepen their understanding of the philosophy, even after the Samadhi of Srila Prabhupada, some devotees began to approach other senior Vaishnavas in the Vaishnava Mandal to try to reconcile some of these teachings and some of these concerns and confusions. So, the next evolution of a teaching that was given, and I don't mean the teaching itself was new because Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur used the same narrative, but the next evolution was that the Jiva's genesis or origin was in the Tatashta. So this word Tatashta became like the paramount new conceptual phrase to describe everything that we thought we previously did not know about the origin of the Jiva. The Jiva's Tatashta Shakti, they came from the Tatashta region, and we had all of these explanations regarding Tatashta, Tatashta, Tatashta. Coming out of the Tatashta, you could look one way or another, either towards the spiritual world or towards the material world, and according to that look that you took one way or another, that was the basis of whether you went to the spiritual world and were associated as a Nitya associated Bhagavan, or whether you came to the material world. So this was the narrative. So the question is, how does that align with the statements that we have been in the material world from time without any beginning? So, and this has come from, also stalwart acharyas in our immediate contemporary Guru Varga, right? And back to Bhaktivinoda Thakur, apparently, right? So first, I need to establish a basis for the authority of whatever I will say going forward. Because, I'm also not in a position to state something, this is the truth, just because I said it's the truth, right? So first, let's take a look at Srila Gurudev, my own Guru Parapadma, Nitya Pravishto Vishnu Pada Paramahamsa, Astotara Sriman, Srila Bhaktivedanta Narayana Goswami Maharaj. The question was asked because there was a discussion on Jiva Tattva. This took place, let me look it up here. This was a morning walk in June of 2008. And there was apparently a discussion on Jiva Tattva. One devotee is asking, I won't mention the devotee's name. He says, if the Jiva's position is Chit, conscious, transcendental, how is it that he's coming via the Tatastha Shakti, since the Tatastha Shakti is inferior to Chit Shakti? So this is a question, it's a very good question. So, and I'm sure the genesis of this must have been discussions on Jaiva Dharma. Srila Gurudev answers him, the Jiva is Chit Shakti. The theory of Tatastha Shakti has been told only as an example. In fact, there is no Tatastha as a specific area between the spiritual and material worlds. Okay, so mic drop, boom, what? Right? Let's deal with that first. In fact, there is no tatashta as a specific area between the spiritual world and the material worlds. Tatashta as a line between two worlds is imaginary. Directly from the lotus mouth of Srila Gurudev. Right? Tatashta Shakti is also Chit Shakti because Tatashta Shakti is also Chit, means it's conscious, it's not inert. So, let's begin to deal with that and go back somewhat to the genesis of Tatastha Shakti and where the various understandings about Tatastha Shakti have originated. So that would be in the 15th chapter of Jiva Dharma. And I will take time to go through some of the aspects here so that things are crystal. So first we have the statement Gurudev saying there is no specific area or place called Tatastha as a locale or a region. That concept is imaginary. And it's been told like that in the same fashion of the Jivas having been with Krishna and fallen from grace as a narrative to do two things. Help us understand a constitutional relationship with Krishna and at the same time explain our current condition without having to arouse, which you'll even find in Jiva Dharma is going to come up, arouse the complete spectrum of questions that will arise about why we are placed in a position of suffering, etc., and others are not. Right? So first, let's go and deal with Tatastha Shakti and look at the genesis of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's using the idea of Tatastha Shakti and how he's explaining it. Jiva Dharma is the basis of it, and it comes in the 15th chapter in a discussion between Brajanath and Babaji Maharaj. So try to follow the sequence. Bhaktivinoda Thakur has written this book called Jiva Dharma, and the conversation is between two personalities. One is aspiring devotee and disciple named Brajanath, and the other is a realized Vaishnava who is Babaji Maharaj. So Brajanath asks about the nature of Jiva Tattva. I'm paraphrasing some things so we can get to the substance. And at one point he says, please be merciful to me and tell me who I really am according to Tattva and why I've come to this world. Right? So that's his question. Now we know there was a similar question asked in Sanatan Siksha by Sanatan Goswami Pad. Keami, kenamai, jare tapatrai. Please, Mahaprabhu, tell me who am I and why I'm suffering the threefold miseries in this material world. Mahaprabhu's answer to Sanatan Goswami was, Jivera Swarup Hoye Krishnera Nityadas. By constitution, you are the Das of Krishna. Srila Jiva Goswami Pad, Srila Baladevi Bhushan Prabhu have also quoted one verse, Dasabhuktu Hari Eva Nanyasheva Kadachana. That by constitution, every Jiva is the Dasa of Krishna and can't be something else, which means any other sense of who we think we are is temporal and has come by the influence of avidya or ignorance. Because by constitution, everyone is the servant of Krishna. What specific type of servant of Krishna, that's a different discussion, right? So, now his question is, who am I really and why have I come to the material world? This is the question he asked. Let me finish one thing first. The second part of the answer of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was, Jivera Tatastha Shakti Ved Abed Prakash. So, Mahaprabhu says that the Jiva is Tatastha Shakti, right? He didn't say anything there about a Tatastha region, a Tatastha locale, a midway point between the spiritual and material worlds. He said they were Tatastha Shakti. In other words, they are a Shakti of Bhagavan called his Tatastha Shakti. So the word Tata means a line. And Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur is going to explain this, but I'm going to paraphrase it so that maybe we can keep moving to so this doesn't become too long, to the significant sections here. So Tata means a line. Sta means in Sanskrit to be situated. So situated in a line or a marginal position between two things is called Tatastha. Right? Like Madhyastha. In a debate in Vedic culture, you had someone who's called the Madhyastha. It means that person is not aligned with one side or the other. They're moderating the debate, so they're neutral. So tatashta means neutral or in a middle position, right? Or in a position where there's not alignment with one side or another, right? So still, nothing here is mentioned about a locale or a particular area. It is a nature of being situated between two things. In this case, tatashta means being situated between the spiritual energy and the material energy. Now again, that is not a locale, that is a nature. So let's go on and read from Jiva Dharma, so it's not so much my input, but directly what Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur is saying. So when this question is asked by Brajanath, Babaji Maharaj quotes a verse from the Das Mool. Das Mool Tattva, if you don't know, you can look in Jiva Dharma, and the Das Mool are 10 different teachings that are given, which summarize pretty much our Gaudiya theology. They're called Das Mula Tattva. So he quotes the first verse from Das Mula Tattva. I'm not going to quote this verse because I'm going to go down because we need to keep moving. So after he quotes the verse, which essentially gives a description that the jivas are like so many tiny sparks emanating from a blazing fire, etc., etc., Brajanath, who has a background in Vedic study and so forth, he asks, this is an exceptional siddhant, and I would like to hear some Vedic praman or Vedic evidence to support it. Now, this is interesting because Brajanath is asking Babaji Maharaj, what you've explained from Das Mool is perfect. It's clear siddhanta, I understand it. But I want some backing from Ved praman. Again, there are 10 types of praman. Among all pramans, Shabda praman is considered superior. Shabda praman means what has come from Sastra. Right? So he's asking, please give me a Sastra praman, right? Which will also explain the sadhu vakya that you told. Sadhu vakya means what sadhus or rishis have taught. Right? So he's saying, please give me a Vedic evidence for this as well. So then, Babaji Maharaj quotes from the Brihad Aranyakya Upanishad. And he quotes a verse which parallels the verse he quoted from Das Mula, explaining pretty much the same thing. Now, he goes on to continue quoting from the Brihad Aranyakya Upanishad, and in the course of quoting Brihad Aranyakya Upanishad, he comes across a very famous quote from the 4th chapter of Brihad Aranyakya Upanishad, which says, Tajyata mahamatya ube kule anuscharati Purvan chaparan chayevam evyam purusha eta abho antva anusancharati swapnatam cha burattam cha. So he says here, just as a large fish in a river sometimes goes to the eastern bank and sometimes to the western bank, so the jiva being situated in the karanajal, means the causal ocean, what that lies in between the inner and the conscious worlds. He's talking about the causal ocean, right? Also gradually wanders from one bank to the other bank. The place of dreaming and the place of wakefulness. Now, if you will look at the Brihad Aranyakya Upanishad, which I did, I went back and looked in the Brihad Aranyakya Upanishad so I could have context of how and why this verse is being quoted. In that section of the Brihad Aranyakya Upanishad, it is not anything to do with the origin of the jiva. That section of the Brihad Aranyakya Upanishad is describing various states of consciousness of a jiva. Meaning, what is the difference between the state of wakefulness when the jiva is asleep and dreaming, when the jiva is in deep sleep, called susupti, and what is the state of consciousness in the transition from leaving one body going to another? That's what that chapter of Brihad Aranyakya Upanishad is about. So why did Bhaktivinoda Thakur quote it regarding the origin of the jiva? So, then you get it now as Brajanath goes on. What is the Vedantic meaning of the word tatashta? So now Brajanath is bringing into context the fact that Bhaktivinoda Thakur quoted an example to describe various states of consciousness, in particularly to emphasize the position, the tendency of the jiva to be in between two positions. So he described it in this verse that's used as an example of the eastern and western banks of a lake, right? So now, Babaji goes on to describe the space between the ocean and the land is called tata, because now he's explaining the word tatashta. He's giving the etymology and by example, right? The space between the ocean and the land is called tata, or the shore. But the place that touches the ocean is actually nothing but land. So where is the shore? The tata is the line of distinction that separates the ocean from the land. So let me just paraphrase this and make it simple. He says that the tata is an imperceptible line of where water and land divide, right? Because it's very hard to see if you go to a beach or something where the ocean ends and the sand begins, right? There's an imperceptible line where that happens, right? But it's difficult to see. So now, here's where I want to get to my point. Brajanath asked the next question. I understood the word, the etymology you're explaining by example of the word tatashta. So follow the context here. Brajanath asked, who am I? He gave examples from Das Mula. Then he gave examples from the Brihad Aranyaki Upanishad. In that course of that, then Brajanath asked, explain the word tatashta to me. He gives an explanation by example of the word tatashta. Now Brajanath asks him, what is tatashta swabhav? This word swabhav is important because now that he's understood the word tatashta, he wants to know how that applies to the jiva, the tendency of the jiva being tatashta. So he's not asking about a locale. He's not asking about a history. He's asking to have the nature of the jiva being marginal and hence able to be influenced by spiritual material energy. What is the nature of being like that? That is tatashta swabhav. So that's his question. So now, Srila Babaji Maharaj goes on to give so many examples explaining what is tatashta swabhav. So one is that tatashta swabhav is the eligibility to come under the control of either of Krishna's Shaktis, meaning the spiritual Shakti, Antaranga Shakti, or Bahiranga Shakti, the external energy. That is the meaning of tatashta swabhav. Has nothing to do with a locale, a place, a time, a history, or anything. And the context of the conversation is Brajanath is asking Babaji Maharaj to explain this tendency in the jiva. He didn't ask him for a historical account of the jiva. He asked him to explain what it means to be tatashta swabhav. So therefore, Babaji Maharaj goes on and gives several explanations and examples regarding the nature of being tatashta swabhav. Right? Then he comes down to a certain point, and I'm trying to get to that place right now, where Brajanath asks a question. You said earlier that the Chit world is eternal and so are the jivas. If this is true, how can an eternal entity possibly be created, manifested, or produced? So now Brajanath is settling this issue for us. The jivas are eternal. So how can we have discussions? Because in the course of the examples given by Babaji, or Bhaktivinoda Thakur in the ultimate sense, meaning he's writing this, right? How can you talk about examples where ideas of creation, produced or manifested, come into play when we know the jivas are eternal? So Babaji Maharaj answers the question. The time and space that you experience in this material world is completely different from time and space in the spiritual world. Material time is divided into three aspects, past, present, and future. However, in the spiritual world, there's only undivided, eternally present time. This is called Nitya Vartmanakala. So now he says why he was using these words like manifested, produced, etc. whatever we say or describe in the material world is under the jurisdiction of material time. And so when we say the jivas were created, the spiritual world was manifested, etc., we're speaking like this because our language is infused with the defects of material availability. In other words, we can't give expression to eternal reality by the nature of the language we have here. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur here cites the fault in Prakrit Bhasha, means material language, in being able to express those kind of ideals. So naturally the words created, generated, produced come up. And because he cited them in the examples that were given, he's now clarifying why he had to do that. So then he goes on and he explains that all Vaishnavas say the Jiva is an eternal servant of Krishna. That is his eternal nature. So he says this is the constitutional position that we're all eternal servants of Krishna. And that he is now bound by Maya because he has forgotten that eternal nature. So he says everybody speaks like this. But then he goes on to clarify. However, everyone knows that the Jiva is an eternal entity of which there are only two types. Let me read it again. However, everyone knows the Jiva is an eternal entity of which there are only two types, Nitya Mukta and Nitya or Anadi Bhada. There is no third place of the Jiva like a waiting room or a green room or a locale called Tatashta where Jivas are staged and then come out, new Jivas come out in a stage there waiting to come to either the spiritual or material world. So then he goes on to say, I've told everything like this because of one, the limits of language, and two, I've told it as an example. And he cites that this is called Arundhati Darshan Nyaya. Arundhati Darshan Nyaya means to take something, literally, it means to take, if you want to find a certain star in a constellation, you find a bigger star and you point to that star, which is easily able to be seen, and then you say, now look slightly left, and you'll see the smaller one. So this is called Arundhati Darshan Nyaya. The logic of using a bigger star to find a smaller one. I'm just paraphrasing here. So he says, I've used all the examples I've given for this purpose, to give examples to explain what is the Tashta Swabhav. I was not reciting a history. I wasn't reciting a Siddhantic origin of the Jiva. I've just explained, everybody knows, which means, obviously, all the Vaishnavas and realized Vaishnavas, that the Jiva is eternal. There's only two types. Those who are eternally liberated and those who from Anadi Kal have been bound in the material world. This aligns with the Siddhanta in Bhagavatam, Anadi Avidya Yuktasha. So now, in the 16th chapter, which I'm only going to paraphrase because of time, the argument arises there, why then would Krishna put us in a situation where we had to be in this material world under sometimes suffering, sometimes eking out some small enjoyment from Anadikal, or time without any beginning. So then, Babaji Maharaj answers, Bhaktivinoda is saying, Babaji Maharaj answers this question by saying, listen, Bhagavan has many leelas. And this creation leela or Shrishti leela is one of them. And therefore, again paraphrasing, the Jiva should understand that being in the Shrishti leela of Bhagavan, there is no fault attributed to anybody for that. It is not Bhagavan's fault that we're in the Shrishti leela. It is neither the Jiva's fault. What is the Jiva's fault is the continuum of executing free will that is adverse to the service of his constitutional position of being the Das of Krishna. That's the fault. The fault is not an original fault like original sin. The fault is a continuum of being Bahira-mukh towards Bhagavan. Bahira-mukh means being turned away or looking towards your own self-interest. That is the fault. That is the inherent fault in Tatashta Swabhav. So then the argument could come, well, why would Krishna arrange such a thing? Because within the context of the Jivas being Tatashta Swabhav is this ingredient called free will. I've explained on another video that free will and Swatantrata are not the same thing. The word Swatantrata means independence. God is independent, right? Abhigya Swara, the very first verse of Srimad Bhagavatam. Janmadhyasya yata anvaya itarachas cha artishu abhigya swarat. God is independent. He can do anything he wants, right? But the jivas are not independent like that. They don't have control over the energies of God. God has control over those energies. So free will has only a limited and a particular purpose and use. The particular purpose and use of free will is to become an ingredient in loving God. It is one of the ingredients in love because it provides the sense of the freedom to love God. It is not absolute independence. So I've already explained in another video that free will would not have the potency to change the dynamics of the spiritual world and allow you to become illusioned. There is no illusion in the spiritual world. And your free will can't change the dynamics of the spiritual world. I'll give you an example in a material sense. If there is a storm outside and it is raining, we don't have control over material nature. We have free will to go inside or outside, but we can't control nature. So if you're outside, you can't say, by my free will, I don't want it to be raining. You understand? What you do have is the option to go in or out, right? You don't have the free will to change the atmosphere in that atmosphere. Or you can't say, well, since I'm indoors and the rain looks very beautiful and refreshing, I want it to rain inside the house. So your free will has a limitation. It doesn't change things beyond its jurisdiction. So in the spiritual world, you can't change the atmosphere of the spiritual world, which has no ignorance, to allow your free will to be exercised to be in ignorance. That's not logical, it's not sastric, it's not siddhantic. Okay? So, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur goes on to explain in the 16th chapter that because this Srishti Leela is one of the Leelas of Bhagavan, and there are jivas here, Bhagavan derives pleasure from the Leela. He's not deriving pleasure, oh, I'm watching jivas suffer and I'm a masochist and I'm enjoying watching people suffering. That idea arises because of ahamkar, false ego. First of all, who's suffering? I've explained this in another video. The Atma actually does not have any suffering. When Jiva Goswami in Paramatma Sandarbha, Anuchad 19 going, but he explains 21 characteristics of the Atma. One of those characteristics is Chid Ananda Atmakam. Then he gives the commentary. Chid Ananda Atmakam means the Atma is conscious, it's not jad, it's not inert. And Ananda Atmaka means Dukkha Pratyogika. There is no misery in the Atma itself. So where does misery come from? The vicarious identification with ignorance. Once you identify with ignorance, right, then misery arises. And the vicarious identification is so strong that we're convinced I am this body. So any pains, pleasures, emotional ups and downs experienced by the gross or subtle body, the identification is so strong, I'm experiencing them as the Atma. But the source of the misery, pain, suffering, or anything else is not actually in the Atma. Therefore, really, technically speaking, nobody's suffering. It is an illusion which comes about due to our vicarious identification, which is why our acharyas use words like a dream or dream state to kind of give a pictorial understanding of this idea of vicarious identification with the material energy. Also, it's explained in Chaitanya Charitamrita, Swanksa Vibhinangsa Rupahana Vistar Ananta Vaikunte Brahmanande Karena Vihar. that Bhagavan has Leelas in both the Ananta Vaikunta, which means all the spiritual world, and the Brahmanandas within the material world. He comes here in so many different incarnations and performs so many pastimes. Why? Because the pure devotees of the Lord also descend here under the influence of the Yogamaya Shakti, the internal potency, in order to deliver the jivas who have been bound here from time without any beginning. And to give pleasure to those devotees, Paritranaya Sadhunam, Anugrahaya Bhaktanam, so many sastric verses, to give pleasure to those devotees, the Lord appears here and performs pastimes. By those pastimes, Bhajate Tadrasikritva Yatshritva Tatparo. If the Anadibhata Jivas will hear those pastimes from the mouth of pure devotees whom Bhagavan has come to show his mercy to, we will also become liberated or freed from the avidya cycle. And therefore, we will turn back towards Bhagavan, and our constitutional nature will come out, and at that time, the actual spiritual reality of the jiva begins to manifest, and over the course of the practice of sadhana bhakti and the kripa of pure devotees, the reality of the individual jivas manifest as a particular relationship with Bhagavan. It depends on the path you're following. I'm not getting into details here. Those jivas who take up the sadhana regarding Gyan may obtain Brahmananda. Those jivas who don't reach the level of Brahmananda may come to Atma Ananda, which means they simply realize the difference between the body and the soul. But that position is very fragile because it's not a standing in the spiritual existence. It's only knowledge of the separation of matter and spirit. So the verse, Ye Neuravindokshavi Mukti Maninis Twayastabhavara Vishuddha Buddhaya. Those whose intelligence has not been imbued with Vishuddha Sattva or spiritual energy could fall down again from Atmananda into the material sphere. Those who obtain Brahmananda, very rare they can fall. Right? In fact, because Brahmananda, Brahmanohi Pratishtaham, is the direct energy of Bhagavan, you don't really fall from Brahmananda. So where our Srila Prabhupada has written that in his book, he's meaning Brahmananda as Atma Anandis, those who have simply gotten free from the idea of ignorance, but they're not situated in the actual connection with either Krishna or Krishna's energy. We can go into that in more detail if somebody has questions about it. They can be liberated from that condition. It's explained in Brihad Bhagavatamrita, right? So, but here the point being that hopefully we've been able to now describe why our acharyas have used various narratives. We've gone from the narrative of the allegorical original fall from grace and how that was meant to inspire us to practice bhakti. Similarly, as devotees became more mature and their philosophical perspectives grew, then the narrative, such as the examples given by Bhaktivinoda Thakur, have come down through our contemporary acharyas, right? When devotees went to the lotus feet of Pujapad Srila Bhakti Rakshak Srila Goswami Maharaj, also onto the lotus feet of many other contemporary acharyas, they also give explanation like this, that there's a tatashta, and that tatashta region is a neutral position under which the jiva has access to seeing both sides. And making the wrong decision, they misuse their independence from that position, not the spiritual world, and come here. But again, that is a narrative to again accommodate the fact that for a lot of people, it would be difficult to digest the idea of being anadibhata. I'll read one last thing from Bhaktivinoda Thakur, confirming what I just said now. Where is that? I read the part that all Vaishnavas say that Jiva is an eternal servant of Krishna. His eternal nature is to serve Krishna, and now he is bound by Maya. Everyone knows that Jiva is an eternal entity, of which there are only two types, Nitya Mukta and Nitya Bhata, or Nadi Bhata. The subject has been explained this way. Here's the important part. Only because the conditioned human intellect being controlled by pramad. So here pramad is translated as inattentiveness. But pramada means, pra means like prakrishtarupe means completely. Mad means intoxicated. So that intoxication means by our samsara life. Right? I'm absorbed in this, that, I'm married, this, that. So many different things that we're absorbed in besides straight and narrow path of bhakti, that sometimes it is not easy to come and explain some deep level of siddhanta and it be digestible, because we're not completely clear-minded and able to just funnel in, pure information or pure teaching. And this is not my saying. Bhaktivinoda Thakur is directly saying that things have been explained like this because the human intellect is pramad, completely intoxicated by all kinds of other things. And not until there is a clearing in the consciousness or the chitta of the jiva can, in the placid state of that level of consciousness, can the teachings come in without the interference of many material impressions and so forth and so on. You understand? Just like it is a material impression that why should I suffer and somebody else didn't have to suffer. That's coming from the ahamkar, because if you realize anything about the Atma is not suffering. You understand? So therefore, if the basis of the question about your condition is based from the platform of being a conditioned being, right? I am this body, and I'm now ascribing a question about my suffering, right? We're already at 1 + 1 is 3. And therefore, everything else after that is not going to be really digestible or correct. So only when you're asking a question from the platform of the soul can the answer come through unfiltered, like Sanatana Goswami asked. Keami, Kenamai, Jaritapatra. He asked this question, just as Brajanath asked the question. And Mahaprabhu gave the complete answer. Jivera Sarup, Hoya, Krishna, Nitya Das, constitutionally a servant of Krishna. Why are you suffering? Jivera Tatashta Shakti Beda Be Prakash. Because as a Tatashta Jiva, having Tatashta Swabhav, you have become influenced by the external energy. Of course, in the case of Sanatana Goswami, it's just for our sake that he's saying like this. You become influenced by the external energy. Why? Because the jiva has this marginal nature. It is called Tatashta Swabhav. So hopefully this now makes clear that the sort of evolved teaching from falling from grace to falling from Tatashta has now been clarified. Actually, we do not fall from either situation. The jivas have a, from time without beginning, connection with the avidya and maya, and that connection is broken because the word anadi means something that has no beginning, but it does have an end. That connection comes to an end at the time we begin to get the touching of the internal energy through spiritual connection, right? And the spiritual connections may be varied in levels, but certainly if it's a spiritual connection based on the impressions coming from bhakti, then gradually the jiva through shraddha, sadhu sangha, bhajana kriya, natana vritti, nishta ruchi, asakti, and then finally in bhav, become actualized or realized in their actual spiritual identity, right? But beginning from ado shraddha, beginning from that first impression of shraddha or faith, the jiva begins to break the connection with the cycle of samsara and the connection with avidya or maya. All right? My Dandavat Pranam devotees, if there's any corrections or comments, they can go in the thread here. If anybody has a particular question, you can inbox me. But I'll probably answer it like I've been doing now, because sometimes I get questions and they're so long. Also, as I mentioned many times before, by answering questions online like this, it facilitates not only my own edification, because more senior devotees may be able to chime in and make corrections and make elucidations, but it's also helpful to everyone else who may be having this question or has been part of the discussion. All right, my Dandavat Pranam devotees. Panchakalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhaveva cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Jai Radhe Radhe.